This is Redefining Trade, the podcast brought to you by TradeWindow to shine a light on the future of trade. Every month, our host Peter Foyston will be joined by those who are shifting the dial for trade across New Zealand, Australia, and Asia. We will be exploring the latest thinking on trade innovation, supply chain management, export trends, digital trade, blockchain, trade law, trade in the face of COVID-19, and we'll be opening a whole new window on the world of exporting.
Welcome back to Redefining Trade, the broadcast that brings you the latest insights on the changing world of trade. Today, we have Arnold Jorge, CEO of the Export Council of Australia, joining us. Arnold is a former senior trade official, diplomat, and consultant with over 20 years of experience in international trade, aid, entrepreneurship, and marketing. He was formerly principal advisor with the Washington, D.C.-based Center for International Private Enterprise, director of Aid for Trade in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and deputy head of mission of the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. He's represented Australia in global forums and trade negotiations, including in the World Trade Organization, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. So, Arnold, welcome. Thanks so much. And first, so we can just jump right into it, what's your take on the biggest challenge exporters are facing at the moment, and what can we do to raise awareness of these challenges?
Hello, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here today. Exporters are facing challenges that are unprecedented in scale and coming from multiple fronts. In discussions with exporters, they said to me that the conditions they have been facing the last 18 months have been much tougher than what they have encountered before. I believe exporters are confronting what I have categorized as the 3 C's: COVID, China, or the intensifying geopolitical competition, and containerized shipping, which is in crisis. As you are well aware, COVID has led to shutdown of factories, warehouses and ports due to illnesses of workers, or because authorities have resorted to lockdowns to contain the spread of the virus. That of course, have made things difficult for exporters as well as importers in managing their supply chains. I am hopeful that COVID-19 might soon be under control with the rollout of the vaccines. But I suspect global supply chain conditions will remain difficult in the immediate term. On China, many countries, not just Australia, are having to contend with its rise. We need to acknowledge that it is a superpower, and we must respect its achievements and continuing aspirations. A key element here, I think, is that we need to accept that there are differences between our approaches and viewpoints. But as we acknowledge those differences, we also hope that China will act with greater confidence and poise, reciprocate that respect, and act consistently with global rules and norms. I guess the question is whether our government is sufficiently adept at finding a balanced strategy and smart tactics to separate security efforts from trade dealings. But I guess even if they were sufficiently skillful at this, I worry that the politics will probably override logic. So it's important. We have to keep asking ourselves, what is the end game? Remember, there is a potential significant cost to any missteps. And I'm not just talking about the loss of markets or income or livelihoods. So the Export Council of Australia, we've actually encouraged Australian exporters to diversify their exports, both in terms of new destinations, as well as seeking new product markets within existing jurisdictions. The purpose there is effectively to better manage risk. And it's good to know Australian exporters seem to be doing just that. On the issue of containerized shipping, the cost has dramatically increased. Drewry's World Container Index in the last week shows the cost for a 40-foot container has reached more than $10,000. That's in US dollars. That is a quadruple increase, or nearly 300% increase from just a year ago. In addition to the cost, there are significant delays in transport times. But the more serious issue, we believe anyway, is trying to find containers and space on those vessels. The shipping lines are exploiting the current situation. But I guess fair enough. But what's not fair is that because there is no real competition in the global shipping industry, we cannot expect a return to market equilibrium anytime soon. This means exporters, importers, and consumers will ultimately keep paying the cost and underpin the massive profits of shipping lines. On your final point, which is going back to your question about what could we do to raise awareness, we suggest that exporters engage actively with the government, either directly or through industry bodies such as the Export Council of Australia. Speaking directly to exporters, use us to amplify your voice and connect with others. The effort in terms of coming together with others is definitely worth the while, even if it's just to provide each other with moral support.
Excellent. Well, 3 C's, that sounds like a trilogy, not quite the Four Horsemen, but pretty close in some circumstances, particularly when you think about the overall and inflationary effect of some of these things that may not be as short-lived as everybody's hoping. And you touched a little bit on this, but I'd like to explore it a little bit more. We've seen this new defense alignment with the formation of AUKUS. And what should we read into that with regard to trade in particular, but maybe even in a broader context, and how you see, it could be seen as something which is strictly defense related. It could be seen as something which is far more than that. And I'd really love to get your perspective on what this might mean and how the different players involved might be viewing this, both those that are in this particular alliance, those that are on the edges of the alliance, and there's a number of certainly some of the five, at least 2 of the Five Eyes are definitely not part of it, and those that are maybe confronting this particular alliance.
Look, it is a bit of a mouthful. I think it's called AUKUS, or at least that's how
fantastic.
I think it might be. That's it. So, look, it's a trilateral security agreement between Australia, the UK, and the United States. It makes sense from a geopolitical perspective, but there are flow-on effects on trade. And in that context, I'm not quite sure the authorities are keeping an eye out on the trade element as well as they should. As you know, due to AUKUS commitments, Australia cancelled a submarine contract with France. The French were extremely upset. Apart from the short-term withdrawal of ambassadors, the French and some EU officials have been in the media stressing that Australia cannot be trusted with commercial contracts. We think this has diminished the Australian brand in France and in mainland Europe, and may potentially lead to tougher and even slower Australian EU FTA negotiations. As Australia further intertwines its defense, cyber, and other sensitive communications and information technologies with the US and the UK, it may actually limit who or which countries Australian producers can source or sell their products to. On the positive side, with increased government spending and enhanced technology sharing, Australian advanced technologies industries might actually experience a capacity renaissance. Also, a boom in defense and ITC industries could have a positive spillover effects to other industries. You may be aware that in response to AUKUS, China has decided to join the CPTPP. And the CPTPP, I'm sure your audience knows that it's a regional free trade agreement, anyway, which is based in the Asia-Pacific region. So, look, from our perspective, it was actually a smart move by the Chinese. That now puts the ball back in our court. I hope there will be no open confrontation from the Australian government when dealing with China's application to the CPTPP. We should avoid inviting further trade restrictions against other Australian goods and services exports to China. Before I go on, maybe it might be worthwhile quickly just putting my comments in some context. Australia's exports represent almost a quarter of Australia's GDP. And of those exports, around 40% goes to China. So without doubt, Australia's trade relationship with China is substantial, and so therefore that relationship needs to be managed well. Our engagement with China on CPTPP may also impact on negotiations in the WTO. And if no better efforts are made to separate trade from the heightening geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific region, then it would become more and more difficult to make progress on the global multilateral trade front. Finally, as governments tend to have limited policy bandwidth and resources, there are risks that much needed complementary investments, such as in infrastructure, would not be undertaken by governments. These investments would be crucial if Australia is to maintain its global competitiveness. Look, most of these are beyond the control of Australian businesses, but there are things that they can do. We would suggest exporters to stay informed and read the signs, so they are able to take immediate and appropriate action when conditions change. Exporters need to keep their communications open, maintain good relationships with their partners overseas, and they need to identify the risk and have contingency plans in place, including having greater funds in reserve. We also think that they need to revisit their supply chain strategy. Most of them are already doing that, including where they might actually establish operations. And they need to continue to diversify by seeking new customers in ranging countries and grow by identifying adjacent markets or other customers within existing countries.
Wow, there's just a whole lot of different things intertwined on that. Do you think that this will push the U.S. to actually engage a little bit more with some of its, allies and in terms of other trade agreements, because they, have kind of been in, been out? Do you think this is going to have some other positive knock-on effects of it?
Well, we're hoping, from Australia's perspective, it would be good if the United States actually join the CPTPP. As you would recall, the original TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was an initiative by the United States. It was an effort to pivot from an economic perspective back to the Asia region. Personally, if the United States does not join CPTPP and China does, we think that would actually undermine America's reputation in the region. So our hope is that the United States would join CPTPP. However, we know that there are quite a substantial domestic political issues that may actually constrain them from doing that.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned a little bit about the container crisis, and how are Australian shippers and exporters, how are they supposed to cope with these ever rising costs, ever shrinking capacity? What can they do, and what are there any broader lessons that exporters could take away from this, or a country could take away from this?
We've been speaking to a number of Australian exporters, and in fact, we have also touched base with some in New Zealand. The situation is not good at all, and exporters are struggling. As I mentioned earlier, the freight rates have skyrocketed to unreasonable levels, and there is shortage of space on vessels. Exporters are actually stressed. Imagine having to constantly chase the right schedule so that your product can be delivered sometime this century, and maybe to find a place on those vessels. Then when you think you got a spot, the sailing is cancelled or delayed. And if your container is actually left at the port, guess what? The exporter actually gets penalized with either detention or demurrage charges. These are activities really costing exporters quite a substantial amount. And in one sense, the reputational issue here is suffering now as well. The problem, of course, is not just in Australia and New Zealand. But things are so bad with containerized shipping, mega international firms such as Walmart and IKEA have actually chartered their own vessels. And would you believe Coca-Cola has actually switched from containerized shipping to bulk carriers?
Everything old is new again, it would seem then.
It's really strange. So, but these, they're taking innovative approach, but these are large exporters. For many of the smaller exporters, they don't have that alternative. In fact, some have actually told us already that they have stopped exporting altogether, which is really sad. And some are actually thinking of moving their operations to their overseas markets. And of course, what does that mean? That means losses of revenue, losses of jobs, losses of income. There is a crisis here, but we don't think the government is not, they do not seem to be approaching this with the appropriate level of seriousness. If they are serious about ensuring their security and reliability in supply chains, then they need to treat shipping and logistics accordingly. They'll tell you it's a global problem. They'll tell you the market will eventually correct itself. These are excuses to justify actually not doing anything. The world is no longer working the way it used to be. And as governments expect business to be innovative, we expect that they should do as well. Governments around the world need to come together to find a global solution. Australia and New Zealand governments can actually work together and take a lead on this. We don't need an AUKUS for new submarines. We need an AUKUS for containerized sea freight. So, yeah, so I guess what that means is that there is an opportunity here for government to take meaningful action. I mean, they could facilitate the availability of vessels, including potentially chartering vessels on behalf of smaller exporters. And maybe even just provide new insurance products that are fit for purpose under the current conditions.
Right. Wow. Great. Well, that's certainly very helpful. Now, I have some questions for you on our new 3x3 segment, where I'll ask you 3 questions in 3 minutes or less just to get your gut reaction. It's okay if it's just yes or no as well, or up or down. So let's get into it. So first, who is leading the race in digitized trade right now, Australia or New Zealand?
That's a hard one. Actually, in New Zealand, but hope in the next few years we'll catch up or even leapfrog the Kiwis. So,
well, it's good. It's good to have a good competitive race. So, number 2, the golden age of trade is still in front of us. Yes or no?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. I guess the golden age, it was characterized by peace, stability, and prosperity. I think there may be an initial stage of upheaval before we see that. There are major challenges ahead, I think, on security and technology, health, and even on environmental issues.
Okay, and the third one, by 2030, we will look back on paper-based trade the same way we now look at hard copy telephone books. True or false?
True. And that's probably going against my very pessimistic nature.
Fair enough. I think we can end it there. So first, Arnold, thank you so much for joining me. And I personally really enjoyed it. And you really highlighted in a nice, succinct way some of the key challenges and some interesting ideas of how those could be surmounted. And for everyone else, thanks so much for listening to the Redefining Trade podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with us, look out for our contact details in the show notes or email us at redefiningtrade@tradewindow.io.
Thank you, Peter.
This has been Redefining Trade by TradeWindow with our host Peter Foyston. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit subscribe and keep an eye out for the next episode.